The spring rain had turned the forest floor into a paste of mud and pine needles. Lieutenant James Crawford and his patrol of Special Air Service Commandos moved through the Belgian woods in near silence, their boots squelching softly with each step. It was April 1945, and the war in Europe was collapsing like a house of cards, but no one in Crawford's section felt any relief. They had been operating behind enemy lines for weeks, and the stories filtering back from liberated towns spoke of horrors that defied comprehension. What they were about to discover would haunt every man present for the rest of his life, and it would force them to confront a question that sits at the darkest intersection of justice, vengeance, and the laws of war. Before we go further into this story, if you want to understand the complex moral choices soldiers faced in the final days of World War II, make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. We dive deep into the untold stories that shaped history, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Now back to that Belgian forest and the moment that changed everything for Crawford's patrol. The smell reached them first. It was a stench that veterans would later struggle to describe in words that could convey its true character, a combination of decay and burnt earth and something else, something uniquely human and utterly wrong. Crawford raised his fist, and the patrol froze. Through the trees ahead, they could see a clearing. As they approached with weapons raised, the scene that emerged from behind the dripping branches seemed to belong to another world entirely. A world where the normal rules of human behavior had been suspended and replaced with something monstrous. The clearing was perhaps 50 meters across, ringed by scorched pines. In the center lay bodies. Not soldiers who had fallen in combat, not casualties of artillery or air raids, but civilians, arranged in neat rows, hands bound behind their backs, each with a single bullet wound to the base of the skull. There were men, women, and children. Crawford later estimated 37 bodies, though he admitted he might have lost count. Some of the commandos turned away and vomited. Others simply stood frozen, their minds struggling to process what their eyes were showing them. And then, from a small structure at the edge of the clearing, came movement. 2 SS officers emerged, adjusting their uniforms, apparently unaware of the British patrol. They were laughing about something. The laughter died the instant they saw the commandos. What happened next would be recorded in after-action reports with clinical brevity, but the psychological impact would ripple through decades of military history, war crimes investigations, and debates about the nature of justice in wartime. Crawford gave an order. His men raised their weapons. The SS officers began to protest, raising their hands, invoking the Geneva Conventions, demanding to be taken as prisoners of war. They were executed on the spot, shot down in full view of the bodies they had left in that clearing. No trial, no formal process, no paperwork beyond a terse line in Crawford's report, noting that 2 enemy combatants had been killed during the patrol. This was not an isolated incident. Across the final months of the European war, British commandos and frontline troops encountered scene after scene of Nazi atrocities, and in the aftermath of those discoveries, the normal protocols of prisoner handling were sometimes abandoned in favor of immediate and violent justice. To understand why this happened, we need to go back to the beginning of the war and trace the thread of violence and retaliation that would eventually lead to those forest clearings and liberated concentration camps. The relationship between British forces and the SS had been poisoned from the earliest days of the war. In May 1940, as the British Expeditionary Force retreated toward Dunkirk under the hammer blows of the German Blitzkrieg, 2 separate incidents occurred that would scar the memory of British soldiers and set the stage for brutal reciprocity years later. At Le Paradis, soldiers of the Royal Norfolk Regiment had fought a desperate rearguard action, holding a farmhouse against overwhelming odds before finally surrendering. 97 men emerged from the ruins with their hands raised, expecting to be taken prisoner according to the established rules of war. Instead, they were marched to a nearby field and machine-gunned by troops of the 2nd SS Division Totenkopf. 95 men died in the mud of that French field. Only 2 survived by feigning death beneath the bodies of their comrades, and those survivors would carry the story back to Britain, where it spread through barracks and training camps like wildfire. Just days later, at Wormhout, 80 British and French soldiers who had surrendered after fierce fighting were herded into a barn by troops of the 1st SS Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Grenades were thrown in, and those who tried to escape were shot. 15 men survived to tell the tale, and once again the word spread. The SS does not take prisoners. The SS murders surrendered men. These were not isolated acts by rogue soldiers. They reflected a fundamental contempt for the laws of war that would become characteristic of SS operations throughout the conflict. British soldiers trained for commando operations in the years that followed carried these stories with them. The memory of Le Paradis and Wormhout became part of the oral tradition of elite units, passed from veteran to recruit, a warning and a promise. If you fall into SS hands, expect no mercy. And if you find yourself face to face with SS troops who have committed atrocities, remember what they did to your brothers at Le Paradis. This was not official policy, but it was a current that ran deep through the ranks, and it would influence countless decisions made in the heat of combat years later. Then came October 1942, and Adolf Hitler made the situation infinitely worse. Frustrated by the success of British commando raids along the coasts of occupied Europe, raids that inflicted disproportionate damage and humiliated German defenders, Hitler issued the Kommandobefehl, the Commando Order. This directive declared that all Allied commandos captured in Europe or Africa were to be handed over immediately to the SD, the security service of the SS, where they would be executed. Even if they were wearing proper uniforms, even if they surrendered in accordance with military custom, they were to be killed. The order was distributed throughout the German armed forces, and it was followed. British commandos captured during operations in Norway, France, and the Mediterranean were executed. Their bodies were found after the war, some buried in unmarked graves, others cremated to hide the evidence. The commando order removed any moral ambiguity from the equation. If German forces, particularly the SS, were under explicit orders to murder British commandos, then the social contract that underlies the laws of war had been torn up. Reciprocity, the principle that both sides agree to limit violence in certain ways, no longer applied when facing the SS. By 1944, as Allied forces returned to Western Europe in the wake of the Normandy landings, British commandos and SAS units operated with a clear understanding. They were fighting an enemy that had officially declared them outside the protection of the Geneva Conventions. And when those units began to encounter the true scale of Nazi atrocities, the camps and the massacre sites and the villages where entire populations had been murdered in reprisal operations, something fundamental shifted in the minds of the men on the ground. The training, the discipline, the entire structure of military law that governs the treatment of prisoners, all of it rested on the assumption that the enemy was also bound by those rules. But the evidence arriving daily from liberated territories suggested that the SS, at least, operated in a moral void where no rules applied. Captain David Stirling, founder of the SAS, had established clear protocols for his men. Prisoners were to be taken when practical, treated in accordance with the Geneva Conventions, and handed over to appropriate authorities. But Stirling also understood that his men were fighting a ruthless enemy in circumstances that often made prisoner handling impossible. SAS patrols, operating deep behind German lines, outnumbered and far from friendly forces, could not afford to be burdened with prisoners who might compromise their missions. The official guidance was pragmatic. Take prisoners when you can, eliminate threats when you must, and use your judgment. That judgment would be tested repeatedly in the months ahead. In the summer and autumn of 1944, as SAS squadrons operated across France in support of the Allied advance, They began to find their own men. Small groups of commandos who had been captured during earlier operations turned up in shallow graves, their hands bound with wire, bullet wounds to the head. These discoveries were meticulously documented, photographed and reported up the chain of command. They were also seared into the memories of the men who found them. When those same SAS patrols subsequently captured SS troops, particularly members of units known to have executed commandos, the normal procedures sometimes gave way to immediate execution. These actions were rarely recorded in official reports, but they were remembered by the survivors, and they would surface in post-war debriefings, memoirs, and war crimes investigations. One particularly well-documented case involved a patrol from 1st SAS Regiment operating in the Vosges Mountains of eastern France in October 1944. The patrol discovered the bodies of 4 SAS men who had been captured 2 weeks earlier. The men had been tortured before being shot, and their bodies had been left unburied as a warning. Within hours, the patrol encountered a small group of SS troops, including an officer who matched descriptions from local resistance fighters as having been present at the execution site. The SS troops attempted to surrender. They were shot instead, and the patrol commander later noted in his personal diary that he felt no remorse. He had seen what the SS did to his friends, and he had responded in kind. The British Army would launch investigations into some of these incidents after the war, but prosecutions were rare, and convictions even rarer. The line between legitimate combat action and murder was often impossible to establish years after the fact, particularly when the victims were SS men who had themselves participated in war crimes. The moral complexity deepened exponentially when British forces began liberating concentration camps. Bergen-Belsen, liberated by units of the British 11th Armoured Division on April 15, 1945, remains seared into the collective memory of Britain as the ultimate revelation of Nazi evil. The soldiers who entered that camp found a scene that exceeded even the darkest rumours that had circulated through the Allied ranks. Tens of thousands of emaciated prisoners, thousands of unburied corpses, disease running rampant through barracks where human beings had been reduced to living skeletons. The SS guards who had presided over this hell were still present when British troops arrived, and their capture presented an immediate challenge. These were not soldiers who had committed crimes in the heat of battle. They were functionaries of genocide, men and women who had systematically starved, beaten and murdered tens of thousands of innocent people. The normal procedures of prisoner handling seemed grotesquely inadequate in the face of such industrial-scale atrocity. Some of the SS guards at Bergen-Belsen were taken into custody and would later face trial. Others, according to witness accounts that remain contested, were killed by British soldiers in the hours immediately following liberation. These killings, if they occurred, were not officially sanctioned, but they were also not vigorously investigated. The soldiers who entered Bergen-Belsen had just witnessed the absolute nadir of human cruelty, and their psychological state was such that normal judgment may have been temporarily suspended. One account, relayed years later by a British sergeant who preferred to remain anonymous, described the moment when a young SS guard, barely 20 years old, attempted to blend in with the prisoners by removing his uniform. He was identified by survivors who pointed him out to British troops with a mixture of rage and terror. The sergeant recalled that several of his men simply raised their rifles and shot the guard without waiting for orders. No one stopped them, and no one reported the incident. The sergeant himself felt torn between his training, which demanded that prisoners be protected, and his visceral disgust at what he had just witnessed in the camp. He later said he did nothing to intervene because, in that moment, it seemed like justice. But was it justice, or was it murder? That question would haunt not just individual soldiers, but the entire British military establishment as it grappled with the aftermath of liberation. Brigadier Glyn Hughes, the senior medical officer who oversaw relief operations at Bergen-Belsen, later testified that he had witnessed British soldiers mistreating SS guards, including beatings and deliberate humiliation. He did not report witnessing executions, but he acknowledged that in the chaos of the first days, when thousands of prisoners were dying daily and resources were stretched beyond breaking point, strict adherence to the Geneva Conventions was not the highest priority. Hughes defended the conduct of British troops overall, noting that the overwhelming majority maintained discipline even in the face of horrors that would have justified rage. But he also acknowledged that there were incidents, moments when the normal rules broke down, and he understood why they happened, even if he could not officially condone them. The challenge for historians trying to reconstruct these events decades later is that the documentation is fragmentary and often contradictory. Official reports tend to gloss over or omit entirely any actions that might constitute war crimes by Allied forces. Memoirs and oral histories provide more detail but are subject to the fallibility of memory and the natural human tendency to justify one's own actions. What we can say with confidence is that British commandos and frontline troops, when confronted with evidence of Nazi atrocities, sometimes responded with immediate and lethal force against the perpetrators, bypassing the formal mechanisms of military justice. We can also say that these actions were understood by military authorities, tolerated within certain limits, and rarely punished. This created a grey zone, where the official stance of the British Army, which demanded adherence to the Geneva Conventions and proper treatment of prisoners, coexisted with an unofficial understanding that SS troops, particularly those caught in the act or found at massacre sites, might not receive those protections. The legal framework that governed these situations was clear in theory but murky in practice. The Geneva Conventions of 1929, which Britain had signed and pledged to uphold, required that prisoners of war be treated humanely, protected from violence and intimidation, and given due process if accused of crimes. Summary execution was absolutely forbidden. However, the conventions also recognized that in combat, when soldiers are engaged in active hostilities, the normal rules of prisoner handling might not apply. An enemy combatant who is actively resisting or who poses an immediate threat can be killed. The question becomes, when does an enemy cease to be a combatant and become a prisoner? And what constitutes a genuine threat versus a pretext for execution? British military law was equally clear. Soldiers who murdered prisoners of war could be prosecuted under the Army Act and faced severe penalties, including execution. But prosecutions required evidence, witnesses, and a command structure willing to pursue charges. In the chaos of the final months of the war, with combat operations ongoing and resources stretched thin, the appetite for prosecuting British soldiers for actions against SS troops was virtually non-existent. There were exceptions. In a few cases where executions of prisoners were particularly egregious or well documented, investigations were launched. But even when evidence was clear, the military justice system often declined to prosecute, reasoning that the actions had occurred under extreme stress, that the victims were themselves war criminals, or that pursuing charges would damage morale. This created a de facto policy where official standards were maintained on paper while unofficial practices developed on the ground. Officers like Crawford, the SAS lieutenant from our opening scene, understood that if they executed SS officers at a massacre site, they would likely face no consequences as long as they kept the incident quiet and did not make it a matter of official record. The paperwork could be managed. 2 enemy combatants killed during a patrol, end of story. No one would ask questions, particularly if the patrol had just discovered evidence of SS atrocities. This unspoken understanding allowed individual soldiers and small unit commanders to act as judge, jury, and executioner when they felt the situation warranted it. The psychological impact on the men who carried out these executions is difficult to assess with precision, but patterns emerge from the available accounts. Some veterans expressed no regret, viewing their actions as justified retribution against men who had forfeited any claim to mercy through their own crimes. These men often pointed to the massacre sites, the camps, the bodies of their own comrades, and argued that they had simply delivered the justice that the SS deserved. Other veterans struggled with what they had done, recognizing that in executing prisoners, they had crossed a line and become, in some sense, what they had been fighting against. These men often did not speak about their actions, even decades later, and when they did, it was with a sense of moral ambiguity and unease. A third group seemed to compartmentalize, treating the executions as simply another combat action, no different from shooting an enemy soldier on the battlefield. For these men, the distinction between combatant and prisoner was less important than the distinction between friend and enemy. The SS were the enemy, and in war, enemies are killed. The fact that they had their hands up at the moment of death was a detail, not a moral crisis. What all three groups shared was an understanding that they had been placed in an impossible situation by the nature of the enemy they faced. The SS had committed atrocities on such a scale that normal moral categories seemed inadequate. How do you treat humanely an organization dedicated to mass murder? How do you extend the protections of the Geneva Conventions to men who routinely violated every principle those conventions embodied? These were not abstract questions for the commandos and soldiers on the ground. They were immediate, practical dilemmas that had to be resolved in seconds, often while standing over the bodies of victims or in the presence of traumatized survivors demanding justice. The British High Command was not unaware of these tensions. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commander of British forces in northwest Europe during the final campaign, issued clear directives on prisoner handling that emphasized adherence to the Geneva Conventions. But Montgomery was also a pragmatist who understood that his men were encountering situations that no peacetime training could have prepared them for. His approach was to maintain official standards, while allowing unit commanders considerable discretion in how they interpreted those standards in the field. This meant that while the official position was that all prisoners must be treated according to the conventions, the practical reality was that SS troops, particularly those captured at or near atrocity sites, were at significantly higher risk of summary execution than regular Wehrmacht soldiers. Montgomery did order investigations when reports of prisoner mistreatment reached his headquarters, but he also ensured that those investigations moved slowly and rarely resulted in charges. The message to his troops was clear enough. Do not make a habit of executing prisoners, do not boast about it, do not document it, but if you find yourself in a situation where the normal rules seem inadequate, use your judgment, and the High Command will look the other way. As the war ground to its conclusion in May 1945, the British Army found itself in possession of tens of thousands of SS prisoners, many of whom had served in concentration camps or participated in massacres of civilians. The question of what to do with these men became a matter of high-level policy. Some would be handed over to Soviet forces, particularly those who had committed crimes on the Eastern Front. Others would be held for trial by international tribunals or national courts. But the sheer number of SS prisoners meant that many would simply be screened, processed, and eventually released, their crimes unpunished and often unrecorded. This reality created a sense of frustration among soldiers who had witnessed the atrocities firsthand. They had fought to defeat Nazi Germany, and now they were watching the perpetrators of genocide walk away with minimal consequences. In this context, the summary executions that occurred during the final months of the war took on a different character. They were not just acts of vengeance or battlefield justice. They were, in the minds of some soldiers, the only justice these men would ever face. If the SS officer responsible for the massacre in that Belgian forest was going to be released in a few months for lack of evidence, or because the military tribunal system was overwhelmed, then perhaps the bullet from Crawford's pistol was the only punishment he would receive. This reasoning is morally troubling, but it reflects the thinking of men who had been pushed to the edge of their psychological endurance by what they had witnessed. The post-war reckoning with these events was complicated and incomplete. War crimes investigators from various nations attempted to document SS atrocities and identify perpetrators, but the scale of the crimes overwhelmed the available resources. Thousands of SS men were never formally charged, either because evidence was lacking or because they successfully hid their identities. In this context, the executions carried out by British commandos and frontline troops during the war itself became, in a sense, a form of rough justice that operated outside official channels. Historians have debated for decades whether these actions can be justified, and no consensus has emerged. Some argue that the executions were understandable given the circumstances, but still constituted murder and should have been prosecuted. Others contend that in the context of total war against an enemy that systematically violated every norm of civilized conduct, the normal rules simply did not apply. Still others take a more nuanced position, acknowledging that while the executions cannot be legally justified, they were a predictable human response to extreme provocation and should be understood in that context, rather than condemned from the comfort of peacetime hindsight. What is clear is that the British government and military establishment made a conscious decision not to pursue these cases aggressively. Investigations were launched when evidence was particularly strong or when political pressure demanded action. But even then, prosecutions were rare. The message was that while summary executions of prisoners were officially unacceptable, they would not be treated with the same seriousness as crimes committed against Allied personnel or neutral civilians. This double standard reflected a broader reality of the post-war period. The Allies had defeated Nazi Germany through a combination of overwhelming material superiority and moral clarity about the nature of the enemy. But that moral clarity came at a cost. In demonizing the enemy, in portraying the war as a struggle between civilization and barbarism, the Allies created a context in which normal rules seemed inadequate when applied to captured Nazis. The legacy of these events continues to shape how we think about war crimes, justice, and the limits of military discipline. Modern rules of engagement place enormous emphasis on the protection of prisoners and the avoidance of summary execution under any circumstances. Military personnel are trained extensively on the Geneva Conventions and the legal obligations they impose. But the ghost of those Belgian forests and liberated concentration camps still haunts these discussions. What do you do when confronted with evidence of atrocities so extreme that formal justice seems inadequate? How do you maintain discipline and adherence to law when your soldiers are witnessing horrors that challenge every assumption about human nature? These questions have no easy answers, and the British Commandos, who executed SS officers in the spring of 1945, certainly did not have easy answers. They had clear orders to take prisoners and treat them according to the conventions. They also had clear evidence that the men standing before them had committed monstrous crimes and would likely face no meaningful punishment if processed through official channels. In that moment, with the smell of mass graves in their nostrils and the faces of victims burned into their memories, they made a choice. It was not a choice that can be easily defended under military law or international humanitarian law. It was not a choice that reflects well on the discipline of elite military units, but it was a human choice, made by men who had been asked to fight a war against an enemy that seemed to operate beyond the boundaries of human decency. Whether we judge those men harshly or with understanding depends on how much weight we give to the circumstances they faced versus the principles they violated. As we reflect on these events nearly 80 years later, we should resist the temptation to reduce them to simple narratives of good versus evil, or to use them to justify contemporary violations of prisoner rights. The British Commandos who executed SS officers were not heroes dispensing righteous vengeance, nor were they war criminals equivalent to the Nazis they fought. They were soldiers placed in an impossible situation by the nature of the conflict and the enemy they faced, and they responded in ways that were understandable, even if not justifiable. The true lesson of these events is that war, particularly war against an enemy that systematically violates the most basic norms of humanity, places impossible demands on soldiers and creates moral dilemmas that cannot be resolved by appeals to law or principle alone. We can maintain the fiction that law always governs on the battlefield, or we can acknowledge the messy reality that when soldiers encounter evidence of mass murder, when they stand over the bodies of their own comrades or walk through the hell of a concentration camp, the neat categories of legal and illegal, right and wrong, sometimes dissolve in the face of overwhelming horror. This does not excuse the executions that occurred, but it does help us understand them as something more complex than simple crimes or simple justice. The story of British commandos killing SS officers after discovering massacre sites is ultimately a story about the limits of civilization when confronted with its opposite. It is a story that forces us to ask hard questions about what we would do in similar circumstances, and whether the moral clarity we profess in peacetime would survive the test of standing in that Belgian forest, looking at 37 bodies laid in neat rows, and then facing the men responsible. If you found this exploration of a difficult chapter in military history valuable, make sure you are subscribed to this channel so you do not miss our upcoming episodes. We will continue to examine the complex moral landscape of World War II, including stories of resistance fighters, strategic bombing campaigns, and the aftermath of liberation. These are not easy stories, but they are essential stories if we want to understand what actually happened during the war and what it demanded of the people who fought it. Hit that subscribe button now and join us as we continue to uncover the truth behind the battles and the burden carried by those who fought them. The past is never as simple as we want it to be, but it is always worth understanding on its own terms, in all its complexity and moral ambiguity. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next episode.